Welcome back to another episode of Provident Vox, where we discuss the occult and magic without the bullshit. I'm Baron Aragni.
And I'm Baronessa Aragni. Today we're going to step into some murky waters, a topic that always stirs debate, curiosity, and maybe even a little fear. We're talking about the Necronomicon.
Ah yes, the Book of the Dead, that maybe doesn't even exist. Or maybe it does, depending on who you ask. Some people will say it's nothing more than a fictional invention of H.P. Lovecraft, meant to add atmosphere to his horror stories. Others treat it as a genuine grimoire, a magical text with its own current and its own power.
And what we're going to do today is dig into that tension. Is the Necronomicon just a prop, or is it a valid magical book that you can actually work with in ritual practice? And along the way, we'll explore the role of perception and belief in magic, Lovecraft's inspirations, including a lesser-known myth cycle called the Gods of Pegāna by Lord Dunsany, and why fiction itself can become a living myth when enough people feed it energy.
Perfect, let's get into it.
Before we dive in, we got to ask, what do you think about our new intro?
Yeah, we put it together ourselves, and here's the fun part. The language you hear isn't random. It's actually composed of words of power.
Specifically, we used utterance. You may recognize it from some of our grimoires. We decided to use it to set the tone, to open a current before we even start speaking.
So in a way, you're already in a ritual space with us as the episode begins.
Exactly. And with that said, today's topic couldn't be more fitting.
So let's start with the basics. The Necronomicon first appears in Lovecraft's writing in the 1920s. He attributed it to a so-called mad Arab named Abdul al-Hazred, which is, let's be honest, a deliberately invented author, not unlike King Solomon with the Keys of Solomon.
Yeah, and Lovecraft himself admitted that he made the whole thing up. He even wrote letters to friends, basically saying that he created the book as a recurring motive. He wanted to give his mythos some texture, some sense of depth, the way ancient myths feel real because they reference older texts.
Exactly. It's like a storytelling device. The more you reference a fictional book, the more real it feels. And he used that trick really effectively. By the time readers encountered the Necronomicon in multiple stories, it starts to feel like a legitimate occult tome.
And this is where things get interesting, because in magic, legitimacy isn't about whether something is historically ancient. It's about whether it resonates, whether it creates a doorway in the mind of the practitioner.
Which takes us into the bigger question. Does it matter if the Necronomicon was made up?
This is the core of it. Magic runs on perception and belief. You can have the most ancient grimoire in the world, written on skin in the 1200s, but if you don't believe in it, if you don't engage with its symbols, it's just ink on parchment, or skin.
Exactly, and by contrast, you can take something invented yesterday, if it's symbolically rich, if it speaks to you, if you approach it with the right seriousness, it can work. The subconscious doesn't care about historical footnotes.
It reminds us of Austin Osman Spera's concept of sigils. The whole point is that belief charges the symbol. The same goes for grimoires. They don't have intrinsic power until they're activated through will, perception, and ritual.
And with the Necronomicon, we're dealing with a text that has captured imaginations for almost 100 years. That alone makes it powerful. People have written versions, rewritten them, built rituals out of them. In magical terms, that's a current. That's energy.
And if we're honest, most historical grimoires are hybrids anyway. Look at the Key of Solomon or the Heptameron. They're stitched together from folklore, scripture, astrology, and a lot of, invention. No one complained back then that they were inauthentic. They just used them.
So when people scoff and say, oh, the Necronomicon isn't real, we laugh. Because it has been written after all, so it is real. Because realness in magic is about the use and how efficient it is. Not about whether some possessed monk in the 9th century copied it down from demons and devils. Now let's pivot to something that doesn't get talked about enough. Lovecraft's inspirations. He didn't create the Necronomicon out of nowhere.
Right. One of the big influences was Lord Dunsany's 1905 work, The Gods of Pegāna.
The Gods of Pegāna is fascinating. It's a created myth cycle, a pantheon of strange alien gods with names that feel half familiar, half unearthly. Dunsany wrote it in a very dreamlike tone.
Yeah, he created figures like Mana Yud Sushai, the sleeping creator god who will only awaken when the eternal drummer Skarl stops drumming, or Mung, the god of death, and Kib, the god of things as they are. These deities weren't just window dressing. They created a whole cosmology that felt mythic, even though everyone figured it was fiction.
And Lovecraft loved this. He saw how Dunsany gave his fictional pantheon a sense of weight and seriousness, and he thought, I can do that too, but darker, more cosmic.
Which is how we get things like Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, Azathoth, beings that feel like they belong to some primordial myth older than humanity, even though they were written in the 20th century.
Maybe let's linger here for a second, because the Gods of Pegāna is almost like a parallel grimoire to the Necronomicon. It's worth actually comparing some of Dunsany's gods to Lovecraft's creations.
Yeah, because when you line them up, you see how Lovecraft essentially took the same structure, but shifted the tone from whimsical and dreamlike to utterly cosmic and terrifying.
Take Mana Yuchushai, for instance. He's this distant creator who slumbers while Skull drums to keep him asleep. If Skull ever stops, Mana Yuchushai would wake up and the universe ends. That's basically the same existential terror as Lovecraft's Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of chaos, whose mindless dreaming sustains reality.
Exactly. Both are these unfathomable creator figures, not benevolent fathers, but sleeping forces whose awakening would mean annihilation. The parallel is uncanny.
Then you have Mung, the god of death. He appears without fanfare, and that's it. You're done. Compare that to Nyarlathotep, Lovecraft's crawling chaos. While Nyarlathotep is more active and sinister, both embody inevitability, intrusion, and the stripping away of certainty.
And then there is Kib, the god of things as they are. He basically preserves the mundane structure of the world. He's almost like the cosmic counterweight to chaos. In Lovecraft's mythos, you could argue that role falls more to entities like Cthulhu and Shub-Niggurath, who aren't maintainers of order per se, but their very presence explains why the world is the way it is.
It's almost as if Lovecraft looked at Dunsany's pantheon and said, what if I strip away the whimsy, the lightness, and inject this overwhelming dread instead?
And the result is that Dunsany gives us a dream pantheon while Lovecraft gives us a nightmare pantheon. But structurally, they're brothers.
Which reinforces our point. If you can take Dunsany's Pegāna gods seriously, if you can work with them as a pantheon, then you can do the same with Lovecraft's beings. They operate on the same subconscious and archetypal foundations. The big difference, though, is that the Gods of Pegāna is presented as pure mythology. It doesn't have any ritual layouts, no instructions for evoking or working with those gods.
Right, it's mythic storytelling, powerful, atmospheric, and archetypal, but it doesn't hand you tools. The Necronomicon, on the other hand, is dressed up as a grimoire. It gives you ritual formulas, incantations, seals. It invites you to actually practice with it and not just read it.
And that's why the Necronomicon has developed into an operative system, while Pegāna largely remains a curiosity, unless of course someone decides to ritualize it themselves.
So, is the Necronomicon a valid grimoire? Yes. Not because it has medieval provenance, but because it has everything a working grimoire needs. cosmology, spirits, seals, incantations, and mythic seriousness.
And because practitioners treat it seriously, there are published versions, like the Necronomicon, that actually give you ritual structures, names of spirits, and protective formulas. And people use them. They get results.
And you can't ignore that. Results are results. If people are having visionary experiences, if they're moving energy, if they're seeing shifts in their lives, that tells us that the book functions.
Which means it's alive, in a magical sense. And maybe that's the most important point. The Necronomicon reminds us that myth and fiction can cross over into reality when enough belief, enough perception is invested in them. Something else worth pointing out, and we touched on it in our book, The Hexagrammaton, is that even when Lovecraft or later writers were inventing these beings, they were still drawing from older historical sources.
Oh, absolutely. A great example is the Necronomicon, which leans very heavily on Sumerian and Babylonian myth. You see references to the 50 names of Marduk, for instance. That's not made up for flavor. Those names actually exist in Mesopotamian magical tradition.
And once you realize that, it blurs the line even more. Are you evoking a fictional god, or are you tapping into the resonance of a very old myth that simply has been repackaged with Lovecraftian dressing?
Exactly. It's like a remix. Even when something is supposedly fabricated, it often has its roots in genuine magical or mythological lore, which means the current is still there, waiting to be tapped.
Even if we strip all of that away and say, okay, the old ones are purely invented, no historical parallels at all, that still doesn't make them powerless.
Exactly, because once people start believing in them, once people start feeding them energy, they take on a life of their own.
That's a concept of the thought form or egregore, when a group of practitioners or even a whole culture of readers focus on a being, gives it a name, attributes, rituals, it starts to coalesce in the astral. It becomes a real entity in its own right.
And honestly, this isn't unique to Lovecraft. Tons of deities and spirits that people work with today began the same way, as localized spirits, or personifications of natural forces, or even as poetic inventions that caught on. Over time, enough belief crystallized them.
Which means that even if Nyarlathotep or Cthulhu started as fiction, they may now exist as living thought forms. A magical practice that makes them just as real as any god or angel that's been worshipped for millennia.
And maybe that's the most fascinating thing about the Necronomicon. It shows us that the line between invention and revelation is paper thin. Imagination plus belief equals reality. So when people say, oh, it's just invented, they're missing the point. The fact that it's invented doesn't disqualify it. Invention is how most myth begins. After all gods of humanity are inventions of humanity. That's why they reflect the human condition and human nature so damn well.
And whether through historical roots like the names of Marduk, or through the crystallization of thought forms, these beings had become operative, which is all that matters to the practitioner. Can it be worked with? Does it respond?
And clearly, people are getting responses, which, in a way, validates the Necronomicon as a real grimoire.
Exactly. Real, not because it came from the 9th century, but real because it works. And it's worth saying here, this isn't just armchair theorizing for us. We've actually done a deep dive into the Necronomicon ourselves a good number of years ago, and with some pretty striking success.
Yeah, going into it, we were initially skeptical, but yet again, we approach everything as skeptics anyway. But once we actually worked the rituals, it became clear that there is definitely a living, workable current in there.
One of the first rituals we tested was a Zedinger exorcism, which, for anyone not familiar, is the formula for clearing away unwanted presences. It uses this rhythmic chant of Zedinger Kiakampa, Zedinger Anakampa, basically calling on the power of heaven and earth to banish spirits.
And here's the thing, it works. We've used that incantations numerous times, and the shift in atmosphere is always immediate. The air clears, the tension lifts. It's as strong as any traditional exorcism formula.
And not just banishing rituals, we experimented with all of the operations. And that's what you want from magic. Tangible shifts in perception and experience.
Which brings us back to the big point. It doesn't matter that some armchair practitioner or scholar says, oh, the Necronomicon isn't real. If you can use the words, the seals, the names, and they get results, then it's real enough. And as we always say, power is power regardless of its source.
And in our case, it's been more than real enough. It's been potent, effective, and honestly, surprisingly in how consistent it can be.
Which really drives home what we've been saying. Invention, myth, thought form, whatever you want to call it. Once you engage with it in practice, it comes alive.
And the Necronomicon isn't just a curiosity anymore. For us, it's been a genuinely workable grimoire, one that holds its own alongside the classics and surpasses them in some instances. You know, another thing worth pointing out here, and this really ties all of this together, is that magic in general has always been eclectic. It doesn't matter what paradigm you look at.
Exactly. People love to throw around the word traditional as if there were ever such a thing as a pure, untouched magical system. But the truth is, even the most traditional paradigms have borrowed heavily from others.
Exactly. Take medieval Solomonic magic. It's presented as biblical, but it's loaded with astrology from the Greeks, angelology from the Jewish mysticism, word formulas from Arabic grimoires, and even bits of folk practice.
Or look at Taoist magic. People imagine it as this pristine Chinese system, but in reality it absorbed Buddhist influences, shamanic practices from older traditions, and others as well.
And if we're honest, modern witchcraft is no different. Chaos magic, ceremonial practice, they all draw from multiple wells.
So when someone says, the Necronomicon can't be valid because it borrows from this and that and it's too eclectic, well, so does everything else. That's what makes magic alive. It's a dialogue of traditions, symbols, and practices.
Eclecticism isn't a flaw. It's a natural state of magical practice, which means the Necronomicon, with its blend of Mesopotamian myth, modern invention, and Lovecraftian horror, is actually very much in line with how magical systems have always developed. And the Necronomicon isn't alone in this. There are other so-called forbidden or fictional grimoires that by the same principle can be treated as valid texts.
Absolutely. Think of the Red Book of Dagon, supposedly a 16th century Scottish grimoire, though in reality more legend than fact. It's become a text people use because of the aura of mystery around it.
Or the Vermis Mysteriis, the mysteries of the worm. It started in pulp fiction, but over time occultists have adapted its imagery into actual ritual practice.
And then there's the Black Book of Dagon, another fictional tome. But again, it contains mythic names, atmospheres, and symbolic weight that can absolutely be ritualized, and it has been as well.
In all of these cases, just like the Necronomicon, the dividing line between fiction and grimoire is blurred. Once practitioners use the words, the seals, the callings, once belief is invested, they cross over into the living magical currents.
Grimoires don't need an unbroken historical lineage to be valid. They need symbols, association, and the weight of practice. And all of these so-called forbidden books fit the bill just perfectly. So maybe the lesson here is to not get hung up on whether something is historically true. In magic, truth is pragmatic. If it works, it works.
And if so-called fictional books of horrors has inspired real ritual practice for decades, maybe that's the proof we need that it's a valid grimoire.
And maybe even more than that. Maybe the Necronomicon is a mirror. It shows us how humans create gods, books, and rituals all the time. It's not about whether Lovecraft meant it to be real. It's about what has been done with it.
Exactly. And in that way, it's part of the same tradition as the Gods of Pegāna, the grimoires of medieval Europe, or any other mythic system. The line between invention and revelation is thinner than most people want to admit.
Perfectly said.
Alright, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Thanks everyone for joining us on this dive into Necronomicon. If you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your fellow occult-minded friends. So here's a thought to leave you with. We've been talking about how invented books, even fictional ones, can become real grimoires through belief and practice.
And that makes us wonder, should we create one ourselves? A new forbidden book written deliberately in that style, packed with names, seals, and incantations, to see if it can take on a life of its own like the way the Necronomicon did.
Would you want to see that? Would you want us to put together a grimoire of the never was that could still be worked in practice?
Let us know. Message us, comment, or drop a note wherever you're listening, because maybe the next great forbidden text is still waiting to be written.
Until then, keep questioning what's real, keep experimenting, and don't read strange book out loud after midnight.
As above, so below.
As within, so without.